Hello and welcome to another installment of Macro 2.0. With me as always is Barry Nielsen, a chartered financial analyst at Opportunity Bank. Good to see you again. We're into our fourth episode. Last time we talked for the duration of the program about the Federal Reserve Bank, its structures and its functions and its goals. And we talked a little bit about the dual mandate of achieving moderate inflation, or suppressing inflation beyond a certain level, and full employment, and that those things are difficult to keep in balance, so it's a tough charge for our central bank.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah, and today we just want to talk more about the inflation side of that mandate. You know, what are the instruments or the measures by which the Federal Reserve acts in the market to keep inflation from getting too high, and in the reverse, preventing a serious deflation, which is a more exotic, less familiar, but more dangerous situation. So let's first talk about inflation. I'll tell you, I went to the internet to get a definition, which is pretty basic. And inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising, and consequently, the purchasing power of currency is falling. I think it's fair to say most of us know what it feels like to face inflation if prices are going up and our purchasing power seems to be in decline. It is in decline. How do we get beyond that? What can we say more about inflation? What causes inflation? And then we can talk about how is it controlled through the actions of the Federal Reserve and maybe other forces in the market.
Yeah. Well, inflation, as you stated, is defined as a general rise in the level of prices, which means that a dollar that used to buy one scoop of ice cream or 2 scoops of ice cream now only buys, the same dollar only buys 1 scoop of ice cream.
Yeah.
So that can happen if your wages are also going up, if your income's going up. Your income's going up, prices are going up. That's probably a classical definition of inflation. And maybe that's not a terrible thing. What's not good is if prices are going up and your individual wages are not going up.
Right.
And that's where
there's
inflation,
a spread between, currently and probably normally, the challenge is there's always a spread between the price increases and wage increases. Rarely are they in sync. There's usually, currently, wages aren't keeping up with inflation, or that's the argument a lot of people are making, that in the current environment, wages are in the increase, but they're moving up much more slowly than the prices of essential goods and services.
Well, I'm sure it
Correct
feels
me if
that
I'm wrong.
way.
Yeah.
It feels that way for probably everybody, I would suspect.
Perception plays a role.
Yes. But there is a tendency towards inflation in a market economy because there's a tendency for businesses to want to raise prices, to increase their profit margins, to make more money. But with that comes employees who feel the general rise in prices in aggregate, in everything they shop for and everything they buy. And when they feel that, they, of course, would like a raise, a wage increase. So I think there is probably a natural tendency towards inflation, and we can talk about the role that the supply of money plays in inflation, because if prices are going up in general, wages are going up, by definition, that has to mean that the supply of money is going up.
Yeah.
That is the amount of money in our economy, in the monetary system, the rate at which that money is turning over, known as the velocity of money, that can create a general rise in prices and an inflationary environment. Without the growth in the money supply, technically you cannot have inflation.
Right. So all the natural urges that people have in a market economy to do better, to get more stuff and pay less for it, that's part of the origin of this inflationary phenomenon. But more strictly speaking, our central bank enters into the picture because it is in control of the money supply by various mechanisms. So it can increase the money supply. We talked about quantitative easing as a new way of doing that. They can print more money. Effectively, they're printing more money through quantitative easing. So they play a critical role in allowing inflation to proceed. But we talked earlier, before the program started, about they've established some targets. Like their goal is not zero inflation, and there's reasons for that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Why do they set a target?
Yeah, the Fed has an official inflation target of 2% annual inflation. And I think the reasoning behind that would be that some amount of inflation is necessary to grease the gears, grease the wheels of our economy, to give businesses confidence that prices are generally rising, that they can raise prices. Maybe the easiest way to think about that is to think about the inverse of that. If we were in a deflationary environment where prices were falling, there would be very little confidence amongst businesses about the ability to raise prices. And a lot of that is related to wages. Again, if you think about it, wages are kind of sticky, meaning when businesses raise prices, they don't raise their employees' wages immediately. They seek to make higher margins. Again, the inverse of that is in a deflationary environment, if prices were generally falling, wages are sticky. Nobody wants to see their salary or wage cut, even though prices are falling and they can buy more at the grocery store. They just think that's great, but they don't want a wage decrease. So again, I think the answer to your question is yes. I'm not even sure anybody knows what the optimal amount of inflation on an annual basis is, but the Federal Reserve says it's 2%. That's what we need to kind of grease the wheels of the economy and keep businesses going and hiring.
Okay. Now, I think a lot of folks like myself who are employees of companies or have been employees, usually our wages or income levels are tied to the consumer price index. That's a benchmark for consideration of sort of automatic wage increases. You know, if inflation is going up as measured by the consumer price index, then every employee deserves, sort of an automatic, irrespective of merit and other reasons to raise people's money, productivity. It's just about the cost of living is increasing. One thing I've been curious about is the official CPI, and we read it in the paper. It excludes some rather interesting large-scale essential items like fuel and food. And the explanation I've seen is that, well, those commodities are relatively volatile. They go up and down a lot. And to me, it's like, well, why exclude those when those are that volatility is what we feel most as consumers. When the gas prices go up, you notice it. When my utility bill goes up incrementally over a year, I might not even notice it, but that's included in the CPI. So can you help me understand what's in and what's out?
Yeah, without knowing offhand the exact calculation method of the CPI, it's a basket of goods. And when you're talking about excluding food and energy, there's something called the core CPI, which does exclude some more volatile components of the CPI. And food and energy are a couple of those components. So in some people's mind, the CPI functions as a better gauge in the short term of price pressures or price increases or deflation, if we were to go that direction. by excluding the more volatile components, which would be food and energy. So over the last several years, one of the complaints of the CPI has been that food prices have gone up substantially, but the price of a flat screen television, which is also a component of that CPI calculation, because again, it's a basket of goods, it's a broad basket of goods, have fallen. So the overall level of the CPI, let's just say, for argument's sake, has remained constant. Well, one component, the food component, has gone up substantially. The big screen TV component has gone down. And as the saying goes, you can't eat a big screen TV.
Yeah.
So,
but we also know it's a vital component of our everyday life in terms of the quality of life in modern society. If you don't have a big screen TV, you're hurting.
Yeah.
And food, food's cheap. You can always find cheap food.
Well, good point.
I'm making jest, of course. Well, let's continue talking about inflation. I'm going to bounce some really basic questions off of you, and we'll see where that goes. So, who benefits from inflation? Does anyone benefit from a general increase in prices and the corresponding deterioration of a purchasing power?
Yes.
Who's the winner?
Borrowers are winners in an inflationary environment. Fixed rate borrowers. For example, if you're paying a 4% 30-year fixed rate mortgage on your house and your payment is fixed for the next 360 months at, let's just say, $1,500 a month. And all of a sudden we enter an inflationary environment where because of inflation, your wage doubled. Well, your mortgage payment's still fixed at $1,500 a month. So borrowers benefit from an inflationary environment because their payments, fixed rate borrowers, their loan payments do not go up, but the general level of everything else, including wages, is increasing. So it takes less of a percentage of your paycheck to make your loan payment.
Yeah, that's a great example. Now, correspondingly, on the flip side of that, I would presume then that savers are penalized by inflation.
Well, inflation,
or is that true?
Inflation makes business planning and, let's say, retirement planning and saving a little bit more challenging and difficult because you don't want to enter into, let's say, for example, you don't want to purchase a bond as part of your retirement plan that pays a 4% coupon or rate of interest or yield. And the next thing you know, the current rate on that same bond or the current yield on that same bond is 8%. That 4% that you're going to receive on an annual basis isn't going to buy as much as you thought it would when in a lower inflation environment when you purchased that investment. So the same thing goes for any type of business planning. It makes future planning difficult if the rate of inflation is increasing or unknown. That's why part of the Federal Reserve's mandate is stable prices and moderate long-term interest rates. So high inflation or the threat of inflation can be challenging for businesses and savers.
Yeah. So that dollar I've been saving up, intending to spend it in retirement, isn't going to buy as much when I actually get it out of the bank if inflation is taken off.
It depends on at what rate of interest you invested that dollar, or if it was invested at a variable rate.
Yes. Okay, we'll save that for another time because we could go all over the place with the variable rates. A lot of people have predicted that when the government, the Federal Reserve actually, engaged in quantitative easing on a really massive scale to overcome the Great Recession, to help overcome that. There's a big spurt of federal spending for infrastructure and other projects, but there was also this phenomenon of quantitative easing. A lot of economists, people in the press, said, well, that's going to cause a rather substantial spike in inflation. But that did not happen. Do you have a reason in your head for why it didn't happen the way people expected it to? What conditions or factors weighed against that rational expectation that prices are gonna go up?
Yeah,
money's easing.
Yeah. So I mean, when the Federal Reserve, as we talked about, and you mentioned, bought over $4 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities, they printed money, and they did that to lower interest rates, lower long-term interest rates. At the same time, as we've talked about, they lowered short-term interest rates to near zero. To spur lending and borrowing and risk-taking, and with the goal of job creation and creating economic activity. By expanding the money supply, by easing monetary conditions, and at the same time, as you just mentioned, they implemented, the federal government, Congress, the president, the administration implemented a fiscal spending, and so they tried to create economic activity. Well, you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make a horse drink. So regardless of the amount of money that they injected into our monetary system, our economic system, if people are risk adverse and don't want to borrow, and businesses don't want to expand, that money just sits there. It doesn't turn over. I mentioned earlier something called the velocity of money. That is part of our money supply equation. That how quickly money turns over. And in the case of the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing that took place over the last 9 or 10 years, a lot of that money that they literally printed just sat in banks, and specifically at the Federal Reserve itself in something known as excess reserves. So again, you can print all the money you want, but if you can't
if
make
people aren't
somebody
willing to spend it or invest it,
that's right.
It's not generating inflation.
Yeah, and if businesses if businesses are unwilling to invest and grow for the future, hire employees, then it's nothing happens.
Yeah. Okay. Let's quickly skip to a dire situation where inflation is out of control. Historically, we're witnesses to the phenomenon of hyperinflation. What distinguishes hyperinflation? What is that? And then we can talk about where it's happened, where it might happen again in history, in modern history.
Yeah. Well, again, I think a really important point is that you can't have any inflation without an increase in the money supply. The price of one good can go up relative to the price of another good, but prices cannot rise in general, which again is the definition of inflation, without an increase in the supply of money, the amount of money in circulation.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly where we would define hyperinflation. Inflation in Venezuela over the last couple of years is, I know it's over 50,000% on an annual basis. I don't know exactly what it hit, but that means that somebody in Venezuela, the central bank of Venezuela, if there is one, is printing a whole heck of a lot of bolivars they use in Venezuela.
Yeah.
They are printing so many bolivars that people have to put them in a wheelbarrow to buy take them to the bakery to buy a loaf of bread. And I don't follow that situation closely enough to say specifically what their goal is, other than they must have a lot of debt at the government level that's held by international investors that they are simply inflating away.
That's probably true. And thinking, before Venezuela in recent times, Weimar Germany, before World War II, they had in the 1930s. That's when hyperinflation, I think, hit the New York Times front page worldwide. And it was a big deal because people were actually seen with their wheelbarrows full of cash, and then the next day they'd need two, to buy a loaf of bread. So it's an amazingly distressing condition for people to be in. And then even more recently in Zimbabwe. I think Venezuela is the most recent case, but Zimbabwe did the same thing. So I think you're correct in that leaders without discipline or without the discipline of an independent central bank,
that's a good
they
point.
want to buy favor, they want to get out of their indebtedness, and they go crazy printing money. And as a result, the money becomes worthless.
Yes.
And it's a terribly distressing situation because people are really, they go hungry, they get sick. It's a horrible thing.
It's not a good thing. And no one's going to lend them money on a go-forward basis either. Because again, when you buy the bonds of Venezuela and they're a fixed rate bond and you're receiving a coupon payment of $1,000 a year in bolivars, although most emerging markets, I think we've talked about what a great thing the U.S. dollar is and what advantage we have of being the world's reserve currency. But most debt, for these very reasons that we're talking about, is issued in U.S. dollars. So the investors cannot have the value of their investment inflated away in terms of purchasing power, because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, and people have confidence in it that we won't create a hyperinflationary environment in the U.S.
Yeah. So the whole world is relying on the wisdom of our central bankers and all the people that inform them. Because as you say, I think this is a good place to end, is to remind everyone that it is the dollar is the international reserve currency, that interest rates set in this country weigh heavily on interest rates everywhere and on the flow of capital seeking higher interest rates. When American rates go up, money leaves a lot of foreign countries, and when inflation happens, what happens to international investment? I don't know the answer to the question I'm asking.
Well, we're going back to exchange rates. When yields are higher in the United States, the rate of return is higher in the United States, and that could be driven somewhat by inflation. Money's going to flow to the U.S., the dollar's going to strengthen. That's going to be harder for nations whose debt is denominated in U.S. dollars to repay their debt, because they have to convert their local currency into dollars. It's going to take more of their local currency to buy U.S. dollars to repay their debt. Everything that we've talked about from episode 1 until now is very interrelated. So this is an excellent discussion, I think, that inflation in the U.S. has an impact on the global economy. Now, Europeans might say that, their rates, their yields, their central bank is every bit as important as the Fed, and that might be true. But certainly the U.S. Federal Reserve and their inflation target of 2%, monetary policy, whether they're raising short-term interest rates, their view of the U.S. economy, that has a global impact for sure.
Yeah. We'll end on that note. Next time we're going to talk about debts and deficits, again, primarily from an American perspective, but we know from what you just said, and we just know from the structure of the global economy, debt and deficits in this country have an influence worldwide. So thanks, Barry, for being with us again. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you again next time.